The gunshot echoed across the desolate plains of Kansas Territory. 1859. As Victoria Vaughn clutched her swollen belly and ran faster than she ever thought possible. Her heart pounded against her ribs, her breath coming in desperate gasps as she fled from the men who had once promised her protection. The settlement of Marysville loomed in the distance, little more than a collection of wooden buildings silhouetted against the setting sun, but it represented her only hope. Victoria had been traveling west with a wagon train when everything fell apart. Now, 7 months pregnant and utterly alone, she stumbled toward the distant lights, praying someone would help her before her pursuers caught up. "Just a little farther," she whispered to her unborn child. "Just hold on." Her swollen ankles throbbed with each step. The threadbare shawl did little to shield her from the biting autumn wind. Victoria's once fine dress was tattered and caked with dust, but she held her head high. She might be destitute and desperate, but she still had her dignity. As darkness fell completely, Victoria finally reached the outskirts of Marysville. The small frontier town was just beginning to establish itself along the Big Blue River, and she could hear piano music drifting from the saloon. Men's voices carried on the night air, making her hesitate. She'd learned the hard way that men couldn't be trusted, especially not the kind who frequented saloons. A light rain began to fall as she stood uncertainly at the edge of town. Victoria sought shelter beneath the overhang of a livery stable, her legs finally giving out as she slid down against the rough wooden wall. She would rest, just for a moment, before finding somewhere safer to spend the night. She must have dozed off because she startled awake to the sound of approaching footsteps. Victoria tensed, ready to flee, but her exhausted body refused to cooperate. "Madam, you all right there?" a deep voice asked. Victoria looked up into the concerned face of a man she judged to be in his late 20s. He wore a weather-beaten cowboy hat and had a revolver holstered at his hip, but something in his eyes made her hesitate before running. "I'm fine," she answered, her voice cracking from thirst. "Just resting a moment." The man's gaze traveled to her pregnant belly, then back to her face. "You don't look fine. Where's your husband?" Victoria's chin lifted defiantly. "I have no husband." She expected judgment, disgust, or unwanted advances. What she didn't expect was for the stranger to kneel down to her level, removing his hat to reveal dark blonde hair as he did so. "Name's Brody Reynolds," he said, his blue eyes studying her with unexpected kindness. "I'm the foreman at the Circle R ranch outside town. Can I help you get somewhere safe? It's not good for you or your little one to be out here in this weather." Victoria hesitated. Every instinct told her not to trust him, but what choice did she have? Her baby kicked, as if urging her to accept the stranger's help. "I'm Victoria Vaughn," she finally said, "and I have nowhere to go." Brody nodded, seeming unsurprised by her admission. "When's your baby due?" 2 months, give or take." He rubbed his jawline, which was covered in stubble. "And the father?" Victoria's eyes hardened. "There is no father." "Not anymore." She wrapped her arms protectively around her belly. "No one claims this child but me." To her surprise, Brody didn't press for more information. Instead, he offered his hand to help her up. "Mrs. Sullivan runs a boarding house that might take you in. Let's get you there, get you warm and fed." Victoria accepted his help standing, wincing as her feet protested. Brody noticed her discomfort immediately. "You've been walking a long while," he observed. "It wasn't a question." "From Nebraska Territory," she admitted. "Our wagon train." "There was trouble." Brody's expression darkened. "Indian trouble?" Victoria shook her head. "No, the trouble came from within our own party." She didn't elaborate, and thankfully he didn't ask. As they walked slowly down the main street, Victoria was acutely aware of curious glances from the few townsfolk still out at this hour. She could read the judgment in their eyes, an obviously pregnant woman with no wedding ring, arriving alone at night. The boarding house was a two-story wooden structure with neat curtains in the windows. Light spilled from inside, and Victoria could smell something cooking, stew, perhaps. Her stomach rumbled loudly, and she blushed with embarrassment. Brody pretended not to notice as he knocked on the door. A moment later, it opened to reveal a stout woman with gray streaked hair and a perpetual frown. "Reynolds, what brings you here at this hour?" the woman demanded. Then her gaze fell on Victoria. "And who's this?" "Mrs. Sullivan, this is Miss Vaughn. She needs a place to stay." Mrs. Sullivan's eyes narrowed as she took in Victoria's condition. "I run a respectable establishment, Mr. Reynolds." "Yes, madam, I know that," Brody said smoothly. "Miss Vaughn has had some misfortune on the trail. She's alone and needs help." "I can pay," Victoria said quickly, reaching into her pocket for the few coins she had left. "Not much, but I can work too. I'm handy with a needle and can cook." Mrs. Sullivan's expression softened slightly. "Come in, then. Can't have you standing out in the cold." She shot Brody a look. "You too, I suppose, though don't make a habit of bringing strays to my door after dark." The boarding house's main room was warm and clean, with a fire crackling in the hearth. Several other boarders looked up curiously as they entered. Two older men who Victoria guessed were merchants, and a young woman who might have been a schoolteacher. "This is Miss Vaughn," Mrs. Sullivan announced. "She'll be staying with us for a time." The boarders nodded politely, but Victoria didn't miss their whispers as Mrs. Sullivan led her toward the kitchen. "Sit, girl. You look ready to drop," the older woman instructed. She ladled a bowl of stew and set it before Victoria along with a thick slice of bread. "Eat. We'll sort out the rest after." Victoria didn't need to be told twice. She ate hungrily while Brody explained what little he knew of her situation to Mrs. Sullivan in low tones. "I can pay for her first week," she heard Brody say. "That's not necessary," Victoria interrupted, looking up from her meal. "I told you I can pay my own way." Brody regarded her steadily. "Consider it a loan, then. You can pay me back when you're settled." Victoria wanted to refuse, but pride wouldn't feed her baby. She nodded reluctantly. "A loan, then." "Thank you, Mr. Reynolds. Just Brody, please." After Victoria had eaten, Mrs. Sullivan showed her to a small room on the second floor. It was plain but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a chair by the window. "It's not much, but it's warm," the older woman said. "There's a bathhouse out back if you want to clean up in the morning." "It's perfect," Victoria said sincerely. "Thank you." Mrs. Sullivan hesitated at the door. "The baby's father, he's not coming to find you, is he?" "I don't want trouble here." Victoria shook her head. "No, he's gone." It wasn't entirely a lie. "Well then, get some rest. We can talk about work in the morning." After Mrs. Sullivan left, Victoria sank onto the bed, overwhelmed by the events of the day. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to cry quiet tears of relief, fear, and uncertainty. Her hand rested on her belly, feeling the reassuring movements of her child. "We're safe for now," she whispered. "And I promise, I'll find a way to take care of you." A soft knock at her door startled her. Victoria quickly wiped her tears before opening it a crack. Brody stood there, hat in hands. "Sorry to disturb you, Miss Vaughn. Just wanted to make sure you had everything you needed before I headed back to the ranch." "You've done more than enough," Victoria said. "I don't know how to thank you." "No need for thanks. Anyone would have done the same." Victoria gave him a sad smile. "No, Mr. Reynolds, they wouldn't have. Trust me on that." Brody nodded, understanding in his eyes. "I'll be back in town in a few days. If you need anything before then, Mrs. Sullivan knows how to reach me." After he left, Victoria bolted the door and prepared for bed. As she drifted off to sleep, She found herself thinking of Brody Reynolds' kind eyes and gentle manner. It had been a long time since a man had treated her with such respect, but Victoria knew better than to trust too easily. Men like Thomas had taught her that painful lesson. Still, for the first time in months, she felt a glimmer of hope. Marysville might just be the fresh start she needed. Victoria settled quickly into life at the boarding house. Mrs. Sullivan, though stern, was fair. She allowed Victoria to work off part of her room and board by helping with cooking, cleaning, and mending for the other boarders. The work was tiring in her condition, but Victoria was grateful for it. Every penny she earned was carefully saved for her baby's future. As the weeks passed, Victoria's belly grew larger, and her anxiety about the coming birth increased. She had no doctor, no midwife, no mother or sister to help her through what was to come. Mrs. Sullivan had mentioned that the town had a doctor, but Victoria was wary of men in general and especially reluctant to put herself in such a vulnerable position with a male physician. True to his word, Brody Reynolds returned to town several days after their first meeting. He stopped by the boarding house, ostensibly to collect payment for the loan he'd given her, but Victoria suspected he was checking on her welfare. She found herself looking forward to his visits, which soon became regular occurrences whenever ranch business brought him to Marysville. One crisp November afternoon, Victoria was hanging laundry in the yard behind the boarding house when Brody arrived on his chestnut gelding. He dismounted smoothly and approached, removing his hat as always when addressing her. "Afternoon, Miss Vaughn." "Should you be lifting those heavy wet things in your condition?" Victoria smiled despite herself. "I'm pregnant, Mr. Reynolds, not incapacitated. Besides, work keeps my mind occupied." "Fair enough," he conceded. "But at least let me help you with that basket." He lifted the heavy laundry basket with ease, holding it while Victoria continued pinning sheets and clothing to the line. They worked in comfortable silence for a few minutes before Brody spoke again. "Been meaning to ask you something, Miss Vaughn." Victoria tensed slightly. Here it comes, she thought. The questions about her past, about her baby's father, about how she came to be alone and pregnant in a strange town. "What do you know about horses?" The question was so unexpected that Victoria actually laughed. "Horses? Well, I grew up on a farm in Pennsylvania. I can ride, though not in my current state, obviously. I know basic care." "Why do you ask?" "Ranch is short-handed. Cook broke her arm last week, and the boys are getting tired of my cooking. Thought you might consider taking the position after." He gestured vaguely toward her belly. Victoria stopped hanging laundry and turned to face him directly. "You're offering me a job at your ranch?" "Yes, madam. Comes with room and board for you and the little one. It's not fancy, but it's honest work, and none of the men would bother you. You'd have your own cabin near the main house." Victoria was speechless. A position like this one that included accommodations for her and her child was more than she dared hope for, but suspicion quickly followed gratitude. "Why would you do this for me? You don't even know me." Brody shifted uncomfortably. "Let's just say I know what it's like to be alone in the world, and everyone deserves a chance." Victoria studied him, trying to determine if there was some hidden motive behind his offer. Finding none, she nodded slowly. "I'll consider it, Mr. Reynolds. Thank you. No rush to decide. Position's yours when you're ready." He set down the empty basket. "I should get back to my errands. Sheriff wanted to see me about some cattle rustling in the area." As he turned to leave, Victoria called after him. "Mr. Reynolds," he looked back at her. "Would you like to stay for supper? Mrs. Sullivan always makes too much stew on Thursdays." A smile spread across Brody's face, transforming his usually serious expression. "I'd like that very much, Miss Vaughn." That evening, Victoria learned more about Brody Reynolds. He'd come to Kansas Territory 5 years earlier, working as a ranch hand before saving enough to buy his own small spread. Now he had 8 men working for him and was slowly building a respectable herd. He spoke with pride about his land, but without the boastfulness she'd come to expect from successful men. "And your family?" Victoria asked as they sat on the boarding house porch after dinner. "Are they still back east?" A shadow crossed Brody's face. "Lost my parents to typhoid when I was 16. No siblings. Worked my way west after that." "I'm sorry," Victoria said softly. "I lost my parents to father in a farming accident when I was 12, mother to consumption 3 years later. I went to live with my aunt in Philadelphia after that." "How did you end up heading west?" Brody asked, then quickly added, "You don't have to tell me if you'd rather not." Victoria was silent for a long moment, debating how much to reveal. "I worked as a seamstress in Philadelphia. Met a man named Thomas who said he was a businessman heading to California to establish a mercantile. He was charming, well-spoken." She paused. "We were to be married when we reached Sacramento. But something happened," Brody prompted gently when she fell silent. Victoria nodded. "He wasn't what he seemed. None of it was real. When I discovered I was with child, he—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "You don't need to say more," Brody assured her. "Men like that deserve a special place in hell." Victoria appreciated that he didn't press for details. The truth was too shameful to share. How Thomas had been married all along, how he'd convinced her to use her savings to invest in his business, how he'd abandoned her in the Nebraska Territory when she told him about the baby, taking everything she had. "The wagon train leader allowed me to continue with them, but some of the women, well, they made it clear I wasn't welcome. When we reached Fort Kearney, I decided to make my own way." "That was mighty brave," Brody said, respect evident in his voice. Victoria gave a humorless laugh. "Or mighty foolish. But I couldn't bear their judgment day after day, and I didn't want my child born in that environment." Before Brody could respond, Victoria gasped suddenly, her hand flying to her belly. "What is it?" "The baby." Brody was instantly alert, half rising from his chair. "No, no," Victoria assured him, smiling. "Just a strong kick. Here." Without thinking, she took his hand and placed it on the side of her belly. A moment later, the baby kicked again, and Brody's eyes widened in wonder. "That's something," he murmured. Victoria suddenly realized the intimacy of the moment and withdrew her hand, blushing. "I'm sorry. That was forward of me." "Don't apologize," Brody said, his voice oddly thick with emotion. "I'm honored." The next few weeks saw Victoria and Brody growing closer. He made excuses to come to town more often than ranch business required, and she found herself looking forward to his visits with an anticipation that both thrilled and frightened her. She was wary of trusting a man again, but Brody had proven himself different from Thomas in every way. December arrived with a bitter cold snap. Victoria was now in her final month of pregnancy, her movements slow and deliberate as she navigated her daily chores. Mrs. Sullivan had reduced her workload considerably, insisting that Victoria rest more. "You're carrying low," the older woman observed one morning as Victoria helped prepare breakfast. "Baby will come soon, I expect." Victoria nodded, trying to hide her anxiety. "I hope the weather improves before then. I'd hate to bring Dr. Peterson out in a snowstorm." Mrs. Sullivan gave her a shrewd look. "You still haven't been to see him, have you?" Victoria busied herself with kneading dough. "I will, soon." "Girl, your pride won't help you when that baby decides to come. Dr. Peterson is a good man. He won't judge you." "It's not just that," Victoria admitted. I can't afford a doctor." Mrs. Sullivan sighed. "Should have said something sooner. We women can help each other, you know. I've assisted at plenty of births in my time." Between me and Mrs. Abernathy next door, we'll see you through." Victoria felt tears spring to her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. That afternoon, as a light snow began to fall, Victoria heard the now familiar sound of Brody's horse outside. She went to the window, surprised he'd made the journey in such weather. He stamped snow from his boots in the entryway, his cheeks ruddy from the cold. "Afternoon, ladies," he greeted Victoria and Mrs. Sullivan. "Thought I'd better check on you before this storm gets worse. Might not be able to get to town for a few days once it really hits." "That was thoughtful, Mr. Reynolds," Mrs. Sullivan said. "Come warm yourself by the fire." Victoria just made fresh coffee. As Victoria poured him a cup, she noticed he seemed unusually nervous. He kept adjusting his position in the chair and his eyes darted around the room. "Is something wrong, Mr. Reynolds?" she finally asked. "No, nothing wrong." He cleared his throat. "Actually, I brought you something." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small package wrapped in brown paper. "It's nothing fancy, but I thought, well, every baby needs something of their own." Victoria carefully unwrapped the package to reveal a tiny knitted blanket in soft yellow wool. She ran her fingers over the simple but even stitches. "Did you make this?" Brody's ears reddened. "My mother taught me to knit when I was young. Said every rancher should know how to mend and make do. Haven't done it in years, so it's a bit rough." "It's beautiful," Victoria said sincerely, touched beyond words by the gesture. "Thank you." Mrs. Sullivan, who had been watching this exchange with interest, suddenly announced she needed to check on something in the kitchen, leaving Victoria and Brody alone. "I've been thinking about your job offer," Victoria said after a moment. "I'd like to accept if it's still open." Brody's face lit up. "Of course it is. I'm glad, Miss Vaughn, real glad." "Victoria," she corrected him gently. "I think after all this time you might call me Victoria." "Victoria," he repeated, as if testing the name. "Then you must call me Brody." The storm worsened throughout the evening, and Mrs. Sullivan insisted Brody stay the night rather than risk the journey back to his ranch. He accepted gratefully, taking a room down the hall from Victoria's. Victoria slept fitfully that night, troubled by backaches that came and went. By morning, the pain had intensified, and she realized with a mix of terror and excitement that her baby was coming. She managed to dress and make her way downstairs, where she found Mrs. Sullivan already preparing breakfast. "Mrs. Sullivan," she said, gripping the back of a chair as another pain seized her. "I think it's time." The older woman took one look at Victoria's face and nodded briskly. "So it is. Back to bed with you. I'll send for Mrs. Abernathy." Brody was coming down the stairs as Victoria was making her way back up, supported by Mrs. Sullivan. His face paled when he realized what was happening. "The baby's coming. Should I fetch the doctor?" "No need yet," Mrs. Sullivan assured him. "First babies take their time. But you can make yourself useful and go next door for Mrs. Abernathy." The next 12 hours were the most painful and terrifying of Victoria's life. The contractions grew steadily stronger and closer together as the day wore on. Mrs. Sullivan and Mrs. Abernathy were competent and calm, but as evening approached and Victoria's labor intensified without progressing, even they began to exchange worried glances. "The baby's not turning right," Mrs. Abernathy murmured to Mrs. Sullivan. "We need the doctor." Victoria, exhausted and frightened, clutched at Mrs. Sullivan's hand. "Is something wrong with my baby?" "No, dear, but these things sometimes need a doctor's help. Mr. Reynolds has been pacing downstairs all day. I'll send him for Dr. Peterson." Brody didn't hesitate when Mrs. Sullivan explained the situation. Despite the howling blizzard outside, he immediately prepared to ride to the doctor's house on the other side of town. "Be careful," Victoria called weakly from her bed as he stopped at her door to assure her he would bring help. "I'll be back before you know it," he promised. "You just focus on bringing that baby safely into the world." The journey that should have taken 15 minutes stretched to almost an hour in the blinding snow. By the time Brody returned with Dr. Peterson, Victoria was delirious with pain and fear. The doctor quickly assessed the situation. "The baby's in a breech position," he explained. "I'm going to have to turn it." What followed was the most excruciating experience of Victoria's life. She screamed until her throat was raw as Dr. Peterson worked to turn the baby. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, she heard the words she'd been praying for. The heads crowning. "Push now, Miss Vaughn." With the last of her strength, Victoria pushed, and moments later the room filled with the lusty cries of a newborn. "You have a son, Doctor," Peterson announced, placing the tiny, red-faced infant on Victoria's chest. "A strong, healthy boy." Victoria gazed down at her son through tears of exhaustion and joy. He had a shock of dark hair, and when he briefly opened his eyes, she saw they were a deep blue. He was perfect. "Hello, my love," she whispered. "I'm your mother." After Victoria and the baby were cleaned up and settled, Mrs. Sullivan allowed Brody to come up and see them briefly. He stood awkwardly in the doorway, hat in hand, his face a mixture of relief and awe. "Come in," Victoria invited softly. "Meet my son." Brody approached the bed cautiously, as if afraid he might somehow hurt the tiny bundle in Victoria's arms. When he looked down at the baby, his expression softened in a way Victoria had never seen before. "He's mighty handsome," Brody said. "What will you call him?" Victoria hadn't decided on a name yet. She'd been avoiding thinking too far ahead, focusing only on survival. But looking at her son now, a name came to her. "William," she said. "After my father, William David Vaughn." "That's a fine name," Brody approved. "A strong name for a strong boy." Victoria smiled tiredly. "Thank you for bringing the doctor. Mrs. Sullivan said you nearly froze getting to him." Brody shrugged dismissively. "Wasn't about to let anything happen to you or the little one." The way he said it with such fierce protectiveness made Victoria's heart skip a beat. But she was too exhausted to examine the feeling. Her eyes grew heavy despite her efforts to stay awake. "Rest now," Brody said, noticing her fatigue. "I'll be nearby if you need anything." The next week passed in a blur for Victoria. Baby William Will, as she'd taken to calling him, was a good infant, but the demands of nursing and recovery left her exhausted. Mrs. Sullivan was an invaluable help, showing Victoria how to bathe the baby, how to soothe his occasional colic, how to care for herself as she healed. Brody remained in town for 3 days after Will's birth, ostensibly because of the bad weather, but Victoria suspected he was reluctant to leave them. When he finally returned to his ranch, he promised to come back in a week to check on them and to discuss Victoria's move to the Circle R once she was fully recovered. True to his word, Brody returned exactly 1 week later. Victoria was sitting in the boarding house parlor, Will asleep in a cradle Mrs. Sullivan had found in her attic when he arrived. "How are my 2 favorite people in Marysville?" Brody asked, his smile warm as he entered the room. The casual claim of familiarity sent a pleasant warmth through Victoria. "We're well," she replied. "Will is eating and sleeping like a champion." Brody peered into the cradle. "He's grown already," he marveled. "Children have a way of doing that, Mrs. Sullivan commented as she entered with a tray of coffee. "They're small for such a short time." As they sat talking, Victoria noticed how naturally Brody interacted with Will when the baby awoke. He wasn't afraid to hold him, supporting his head carefully and speaking to him in soft, gentle tones that made the infant stare in fascination. "You're good with him," Victoria observed. "Had some practice with my foreman's kids," Brody explained. "4 of them now, all under 7. They're like little tornadoes when they visit the main house. As the afternoon wore on, Victoria found herself more and more comfortable with Brody. There was an ease between them that she'd never experienced with Thomas or any other man. When Mrs. Sullivan tactfully excused herself to start dinner, leaving them alone with the baby, Victoria decided to ask the question that had been on her mind since Will's birth. "Why have you done so much for us, Brody? The truth, please." Brody was quiet for a long moment, absently stroking Will's tiny hand with his finger as the baby dozed against his chest. "When I first saw you that night, you reminded me of someone," he finally said. "My mother. Not in looks, but in spirit. She was strong like you, determined. When my father died, she kept our small farm going on her own until she took sick." He paused. "I was too young to help much. We lost everything. If someone had shown her the kindness she deserved, well, maybe things would have been different." Victoria was touched by his honesty. "I'm sorry about your mother. It was a long time ago," Brody said, "but I guess I never forgot what it felt like being alone, having no one to turn to. When I saw you that night, I couldn't just walk away." Victoria reached over and placed her hand on his. "I'm glad you didn't." Their eyes met, and for a brief moment, Victoria felt a connection that went beyond friendship or gratitude. But Will chose that moment to fuss, breaking the spell. As Brody prepared to leave that evening, he brought up the subject of Victoria's employment at the ranch. "No rush, of course," he assured her. "You need time to recover and bond with the little one, but the offer stands whenever you're ready." "I was thinking perhaps after New Year's," Victoria suggested. "That would give Will almost a month to grow stronger before the journey." Brody nodded. "Perfect timing. I'll have the cabin ready by then." As the weeks passed, Victoria gained confidence in her role as a mother. Will thrived under her care, growing plumper and more alert each day. Brody visited regularly, always bringing small gifts: a rocking chair for the cabin, tiny socks he'd commissioned from the seamstress in town, a picture book for when Will was older. Christmas came, bringing with it a rare sense of joy for Victoria. The boarding house was festively decorated with pine boughs and red ribbons, and Mrs. Sullivan prepared a feast for all her boarders. Brody joined them, bringing a small pine tree which they decorated with popcorn strings and paper ornaments. "Will's first Christmas," Victoria said softly as she held her son by the fire that evening. "I wish I had more to give him." "You've given him everything important," Brody assured her. "A mother who loves him, safety, warmth. That's more than many children have." Later, after the other boarders had retired, Brody handed Victoria a small package. "Merry Christmas," he said simply. Inside was a silver locket on a delicate chain. When opened, it revealed a tiny space for a portrait. "It's beautiful," Victoria breathed. "Thought you might want something to keep a likeness of Will close to your heart someday," Brody explained. "Town's getting a photographer in the spring." Victoria was speechless at the thoughtfulness of the gift. "I don't have anything for you," she finally managed. "You've given me plenty," Brody assured her. "Having you and Will in my life these past weeks has been gift enough." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning neither was quite ready to acknowledge. New Year's Day, 1860, dawned clear and cold. Victoria packed her few belongings, carefully wrapping Will in layers of blankets for the journey to the Circle R ranch. Mrs. Sullivan hugged her tearfully at the door. "You take care of yourself and that beautiful boy," the older woman instructed. "And don't be a stranger. Come visit when you can." "I will," Victoria promised. "Thank you for everything." Brody had brought his wagon into town, lined with straw and blankets to make it as comfortable as possible for Victoria and Will. The journey to the ranch took about an hour, during which Brody pointed out landmarks and told her about the area. "That's Fallen Creek, never runs dry," even in summer. Best fishing in the county over that ridge, and see that stand of cottonwoods. Good place for picnics come spring. Victoria listened, enjoying his evident pride in his land. She found herself looking forward to exploring it all when the weather warmed. The Circle R ranch was larger than Victoria had imagined. The main house was a substantial two-story structure built of sturdy logs, with a wide porch wrapping around three sides. Several outbuildings clustered nearby: a barn, bunkhouse, smokehouse, and workshop. A short distance away stood a smaller cabin that Brody pointed out as their destination. "That's the cook's cabin," he explained. "Been empty since old Pete moved back east last spring. Mrs. Gardner's been cooking since then, until she broke her arm." The cabin was simple but charming: a main room with a cooking fireplace and small dining area, and two bedrooms separated by a short hallway. Brody had clearly spent time preparing it for their arrival. The floors were swept clean, fresh curtains hung at the windows, and a fire already burned in the hearth, making the space warm and inviting. "I hope it suits you," Brody said, watching Victoria's face anxiously as she explored the rooms. "It's perfect," she assured him, genuinely pleased with her new home. The larger bedroom had a bed with a fresh straw tick mattress covered in clean linens, while the smaller room contained a beautifully crafted wooden cradle. "Did you make this?" Victoria asked, running her hand over the smooth wood of the cradle. Brody nodded, looking slightly embarrassed. "Had some time over Christmas. Thought the little fellow should have a proper place to sleep." Victoria was too moved to speak. This man, who owed her nothing, had shown her and her son more kindness in a few weeks than she'd experienced in years. "I'll let you get settled," Brody said. "Supper's at 6 in the main house. You'll meet the men, then just the 5 who stay through winter. The others will be back in spring roundup time." After he left, Victoria sat in the rocking chair by the fire, nursing Will and contemplating the strange turn her life had taken. 3 months ago, she'd been alone, pregnant, and desperate, fleeing from a man who had used and abandoned her. Now she had a home, employment, and Brody. She wasn't sure what to call their relationship. He was her employer, certainly, but also her friend. And sometimes, when he looked at her, she felt something more: a connection that both thrilled and terrified her. But Victoria was wary of trusting those feelings. She'd been wrong about Thomas, catastrophically wrong. Could she risk being wrong again? That evening, Victoria put on her best dress, one Mrs. Sullivan had helped her alter to accommodate her post-pregnancy figure, and carried Will to the main house. She was nervous about meeting the ranch hands, unsure how they would react to a single mother as their new cook. Brody met her at the door, taking Will so she could remove her shawl. "Ready to meet the crew?" he asked with an encouraging smile. The ranch hands were gathered in the dining room, 4 men of varying ages, all standing respectfully as Victoria entered. Brody introduced them one by one. Joe Mason, the grizzled foreman who'd been with Brody since he bought the ranch. Young Danny Baker, barely 18 and eager to prove himself. Hank Wilson, a taciturn man in his 30s who nodded politely. And Gabriel Torres, who smiled warmly and complimented Will in Spanish-accented English. "Miss Vaughn will be taking over the cooking starting tomorrow," Brody explained. "I expect you all to treat her and her son with the utmost respect." "Yes, boss," they chorused, and Victoria was relieved to see genuine welcome in their eyes. The evening passed pleasantly, with the men sharing stories of ranch life and asking Victoria polite questions about her background. She kept her answers vague but honest, saying only that she'd come west with a wagon train and had been stranded. No one pressed for details, for which she was grateful. As the weeks passed, Victoria fell into a comfortable routine at the Circle R. She rose early to prepare breakfast for the men, then spent her mornings caring for Will and attending to the cabin. Afternoons were for baking bread, preparing the evening meal, and occasionally helping with light ranch chores when Brody or Joe could watch Will. The ranch hands quickly grew fond of Victoria's cooking and of Will, who became a sort of mascot for the bunkhouse. Gabriel, who had 3 children back in Texas, was especially good with the baby, often singing Spanish lullabies that delighted Will. February brought milder weather, and Victoria began taking Will for walks around the ranch, bundled against the lingering chill. Brody often joined them when his work allowed, pointing out improvements he planned to make in the spring and telling her about the history of the land. "My dream is to make this the finest cattle ranch in the territory," he confided one afternoon as they stood on a ridge overlooking the valley where his herd grazed. "Maybe even breed horses eventually." "It's a wonderful dream," Victoria said sincerely, "and you've made an impressive start." Brody glanced at her, a question in his eyes. "Do you ever think about your own dreams, what you want for your future?" Victoria considered the question seriously. "For so long, my only dream was survival. Then it became giving Will a safe home." She paused. "Now I suppose I dream of a place where both of us truly belong, somewhere permanent." "You belong here," Brody said quietly. "Both of you." The words hung between them, weighted with meaning neither was ready to fully address. But something shifted that day, an acknowledgement of possibilities that hadn't existed before. As winter gave way to spring, life at the Circle R grew busier. Additional hands arrived for the spring roundup, and Victoria's days were filled with cooking for the expanded crew. Will, now 4 months old, was growing rapidly, his personality emerging more each day. He was a happy baby, quick to smile, especially when Brody was near. "He thinks you hang the moon," Victoria remarked one evening as Brody entertained Will, who was gurgling with delight at the funny faces Brody made. "Smart kid," Brody replied with a grin. "Clearly takes after his mother." Such compliments had become more frequent lately, as had the moments when Victoria would catch Brody watching her with an expression that made her heart race. But neither of them had taken the next step, both cautious for their own reasons. The catalyst came unexpectedly in late April. Victoria was in the garden behind her cabin, planting vegetables while Will napped inside, when she heard hoofbeats approaching rapidly. Looking up, she saw a rider she didn't recognize galloping toward the main house. Curious, she set aside her trowel and moved closer, arriving just as the stranger dismounted and approached Brody, who had come out onto the porch. "Reynolds, Brody Reynolds?" the man asked, his voice carrying across the yard. "That's me," Brody confirmed. "What can I do for you?" The stranger removed his hat. "Name's Thomas Whitfield. I'm looking for a woman named Victoria Vaughn. Heard in town she might be working here." Victoria froze at the sound of that voice, a voice she'd hoped never to hear again. "Thomas. Here at the Circle R, looking for her." Her first instinct was to run, to grab Will and flee, but where would she go? And Thomas had already seen Brody. If she disappeared, he would simply tell Brody everything, all the shameful details of how she'd been fooled, how she'd given herself to a man who wasn't who he claimed to be. Taking a deep breath, Victoria stepped forward into view. "Hello, Thomas," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Thomas turned, his handsome face breaking into a smile that once would have made her heart flutter but now only filled her with dread. "Victoria, there you are. I've been searching everywhere for you." Brody looked between them, confusion evident on his face. "You know this man, Victoria?" Before she could answer, Thomas strode toward her, reaching for her hands. Victoria stepped back instinctively. "Know me?" "I should think so," Thomas said, his tone jovial but his eyes cold. "I'm her fiancé." Victoria felt sick. Ex-fiancé, she corrected firmly. You made that quite clear when you abandoned me in Nebraska territory. Thomas had the grace to look embarrassed. A terrible misunderstanding. I was called away on urgent business. By the time I returned, the wagon train had moved on without you. I've been searching for months. Victoria couldn't believe his audacity. Urgent business? Is that what you call stealing all my money and disappearing the moment I told you I was with child? Thomas's face hardened momentarily before he schooled it back into a contrite expression. I admit I panicked. The news was unexpected, but I've come to make things right. He glanced at Brody, who was watching the exchange with a thunderous expression. I've come to claim my family. Your family, Victoria repeated incredulously. You denied this child was yours. You said, I was a fool, Thomas interrupted smoothly. Scared of responsibility. But I've changed, Victoria. I want to be a father to our child. Brody stepped forward then, placing himself slightly between Victoria and Thomas. Seems to me if you wanted that, you'd have been here months ago, before the baby was born, before Miss Vaughn had to struggle alone. Thomas's gaze turned calculating as he assessed Brody. And who exactly are you to involve yourself in this matter? I'm the man who found Victoria half dead from exhaustion on the edge of town, Brody said, his voice deceptively calm. I'm the one who made sure she had food and shelter while she waited for her baby to come. I'm the one who nearly froze getting the doctor to her when she was in labor. Where were you for any of that, Mr. Whitfield? Thomas's charm vanished, replaced by cold anger. This is between me and Victoria. She's carrying my child. She was carrying a baby no one claimed, Brody interrupted, his voice rising. You weren't there. You didn't want them. He took a step closer to Victoria. But I do. I'll claim you both. Victoria's breath caught at his words. She looked up at Brody, seeing the determination in his eyes, but also something more of vulnerability, a question. You don't know what you're saying, Thomas sneered. Victoria and I have a history. She belongs with me. The child is mine by blood. Blood doesn't make a father, Brody shot back. Being there does, caring does, loving does. Victoria found her voice at last. Thomas, you need to leave. Whatever we had is long over. You made your choice months ago. Thomas's expression turned ugly. You can't deny me my son. Daughter, Victoria lied automatically, then realized her mistake. A triumphant smile spread across Thomas's face. You don't even know if it's a boy or girl. You're bluffing, Victoria. The child is mine and I have rights. You have nothing, Brody said firmly. You abandoned them both. In the eyes of God and man, that forfeits any claim you might have had. Thomas looked like he might argue further, but something in Brody's stance, perhaps the way his hand rested near his holstered gun, made him reconsider. This isn't over, he said to Victoria. I'll be back with the law if necessary. I wouldn't advise that, Brody replied evenly. Sheriff Burke is a good friend of mine. He doesn't take kindly to men who abandon women and children. Thomas's jaw tightened, but he recognized defeat, at least for the moment. He mounted his horse with a final glare at Victoria. We'll discuss this later when you're being more reasonable. After he rode away, Victoria sagged against the porch railing, her legs suddenly weak. Brody was at her side instantly, supporting her arm. Are you all right? He asked, concern etched on his face. I will be, she managed. I never thought he'd find me. Come inside, Brody urged, leading her to the main house. You're shaking. In Brody's study, with the door closed for privacy, Victoria sank into a leather chair while Brody poured her a small glass of whiskey. For medicinal purposes, he explained with a gentle smile. Victoria took a sip, wincing at the burn but appreciating the warmth that spread through her chest. I should check on Will. Gabriel's keeping an eye on the cabin, Brody assured her. He saw the whole thing from the corral. He'll come get you if Will wakes up. Victoria nodded, relieved. After a moment of silence, she spoke again. I should have told you about Thomas, all of it. You told me what mattered, Brody said. That he abandoned you when you needed him most. There's more. Victoria took another sip of whiskey for courage. He was married, Brody, the whole time. He had a wife back in St. Louis. Brody's expression darkened. Bastard. I was such a fool, Victoria whispered, tears threatening. I believed everything he said. I gave him my savings, my everything. When I told him about the baby, he laughed, said it wasn't his problem and that his wife would never accept another woman's child. That doesn't make you a fool, Victoria. It makes him a liar and a thief. Victoria wiped away a tear. And now he claims to want Will after denying him. I don't believe it for a second. Neither do I, Brody agreed. Men like that don't change. He wants something else. Victoria nodded. Probably heard about your ranch. Thinks I've landed on my feet and wants to take advantage somehow. They sat in silence for a moment before Brody spoke again, hesitation in his voice. Did you mean it? Victoria asked suddenly. What you said to Thomas, about claiming us both. Brody met her gaze steadily. Every word. I've been trying to find the courage to say it for weeks now. He moved from his chair to kneel before her, taking her hands in his. I love you, Victoria, and I love Will as if he were my own son. I want to be his father in all the ways that matter. I want us to be a family. Victoria's heart pounded. Brody, my judgment hasn't been the best when it comes to men. I know you're scared, he said gently. And I know Thomas hurt you badly. I'm not asking for an answer this minute. Just think about it. Let me prove to you that not all men are like him. Victoria studied his face, the sincerity in his blue eyes, the hopeful set of his mouth. This was a man who had shown her nothing but kindness and respect from the moment they met. A man who had held her son within hours of his birth and looked at him with love rather than resentment. I don't need to think about it, she said softly. I already know what's in my heart. I love you too, Brody. I think I have for some time now. The joy that spread across his face was beautiful to behold. He leaned forward, hesitating just a moment before Victoria closed the distance between them, their lips meeting in a sweet, tender kiss that held the promise of all that was to come. When they parted, Brody rested his forehead against hers. We'll need to be prepared if Thomas comes back, he said. I won't let him take you or Will. He won't, Victoria said with newfound confidence. We're stronger together, and as you said, he has no legal claim. He abandoned us, denied his child. No court would side with him. Just to be safe, Brody suggested, we should marry soon if you're willing. Victoria smiled. I am very willing, Mr. Reynolds. They were married 2 weeks later in the small church in Marysville with Mrs. Sullivan standing as Victoria's witness and Joe Mason as Brody's. Will, resplendent in a tiny white suit Mrs. Sullivan had sewn, was held by Gabriel's wife during the ceremony. The whole town turned out for the celebration afterward, eager to witness the union of the mysterious young mother and the respected rancher who had claimed her and her child as his own. Thomas Whitfield did return once more, a month after the wedding. He arrived at the ranch with a lawyer from Topeka, making grand claims about his paternal rights. But he was met by Sheriff Burke, Brody, and Victoria, who presented a united front. The sheriff, true to Brody's word, had little sympathy for a man who had abandoned a pregnant woman. Way I see it, Whitfield, Sheriff Burke drawled, you gave up any claim when you left her to fend for herself. The boy's got a father now, a real one who's legally adopted him. Courts tend to favor stability for the child, and I can't think of anything less stable than handing a baby over to a man who's already proven he can't be trusted. Thomas's lawyer, seeing the situation was hopeless, advised his client to withdraw. With a final venomous glare at Victoria and Brody, Thomas departed Marysville, never to return. As spring turned to summer and summer to fall, the Reynolds family settled into a rhythm of life on the Circle R. Victoria's garden thrived, providing vegetables for the ranch and allowing her to put up preserves for the winter. Will grew rapidly, learning to crawl and then pull himself up, always eager to explore his surroundings. Brody proved to be the father Will deserved, patient, loving, and utterly devoted. He spent hours with the boy, teaching him about ranch life even before Will could fully understand, carrying him on his shoulders to check the herds, reading to him each night before bed. Victoria often found herself watching them together, her heart full to bursting with love for both of them. On a crisp October evening, as they sat on the porch of the main house watching the sunset, Will asleep in Brody's arms, Victoria felt a sense of peace she had never known before. "Happy?" Brody asked, noticing her contented smile. "More than I ever thought possible," she admitted. "A year ago I was alone and terrified, with no idea how I would care for my baby. Now look at us." Brody reached over to take her hand, his thumb caressing her wedding ring. "Best decision I ever made, claiming you both that day." Victoria leaned her head against his shoulder. "I have something to tell you," she said softly. Brody looked down at her, curiosity in his eyes. "Will is going to have a brother or sister come spring," Victoria said, her free hand resting on her still flat stomach. "I'm certain of it." The joy that spread across Brody's face was everything Victoria had hoped for. He carefully shifted Will to one arm so he could pull Victoria close with the other, kissing her with a tenderness that still made her heart race. "A family of 4, he murmured against her lips. "I am truly the richest man in Kansas territory." As the years passed, the Circle R ranch prospered along with the Reynolds family. Will grew into a strong, kind-hearted boy who adored his younger sister, Emma, born the following May, and the twin brothers, James and Michael, who arrived 2 years later. Brody's dream of breeding horses became reality, with Reynolds stock becoming known throughout the territory for its quality and stamina. Victoria never forgot how close she had come to losing everything, how a single act of kindness from a stranger had changed the course of her life. She made it her mission to extend that same kindness to others in need, establishing a fund at the church in Marysville to help women and children in desperate circumstances. 10 years to the day after Brody had found Victoria huddled against the livery stable wall, they stood together on the ridge overlooking their ranch. The main house had been expanded to accommodate their growing family, the herd had tripled in size, and a small schoolhouse now stood near the bunkhouse for the children of the ranch hands as well as their own. "Did you ever imagine this?" Victoria asked, gesturing to the thriving homestead below them. "That night when you found me," Brody considered the question seriously. "Not all of it," he admitted. "But I knew from the moment I saw you that you were special, that helping you was the right thing to do." He smiled, the lines around his eyes crinkling in the way she loved. "I just didn't know it would be the best thing I ever did." Victoria stood on tiptoe to kiss him, still as much in love as the day they wed. "Thank you for claiming us both," she whispered against his lips, "for making us yours." "Always," Brody promised, drawing her close as the sunset painted the Kansas sky in brilliant hues of gold and crimson. "Always and forever." Below them, their children's laughter floated up from the yard where they played under the watchful eye of Gabriel, now the ranch foreman. The sound was the sweetest music to Victoria's ears, a reminder of all they had built together, of the love that had grown from a moment of compassion on a cold autumn night so many years before. In the wild expanse of the Kansas prairie, Victoria had found not just shelter, but a home, not just acceptance, but love, not just a provider, but a partner. And in claiming her and her son, Brody had claimed his own happiness as well, creating a legacy of love that would endure long after the last cattle drive, long after the last horse was bred, long into the future they had built together.